warning from the nation's top infectious disease expert, Dr. Anthony Fauci, telling governors Labor Day weekend will be key in figuring out if the U.S. can control coronavirus in the fall. NBC News medical contributor Dr. Natalie Azar joins me now. Dr. Natalie, first of all, it's so good to see you. Now, let's talk about the impact that just one party or event can be so dangerous. I know we saw these spikes after Memorial Day and the 4th of July, but how can these one-off events be so dangerous?
All right, so I think the easiest way to think about it, Savannah, is to think about the properties and the principles of the virus as we currently know it. Right now, we know that the more that an individual interacts with somebody else and the longer that interaction is, the greater the risk of spread. We also know that the primary mode of transmission is respiratory droplets, so talking, laughing, coughing, sneezing. And we also, unfortunately, now know that about 40% of people are asymptomatic, but they can transmit the virus. So you put all that together, and it's kind of the perfect storm for what we call a super spreading event. That is a gathering of larger groups of people in a congregate setting where we know that the virus can transmit. The saving grace is that most Labor Day activities will probably be held outdoors or should be held outdoors if possible, because we know that that will definitely mitigate some of that risk.
Now, so can people celebrate but still protect themselves and others? Is there a safe way to do that and enjoy Labor Day?
Definitely. And so you can think about it like, probably over the summer, families have been socializing with a smaller group of people, perhaps a little bubble, so outside of their family with a sort of a defined number of people. Try to maintain that if you can this weekend, instead of branching out and going to visit tons of people that you maybe haven't seen all summer. It's also important that when you are with your family, you could definitely mingle with people from other families, but if you do so, you have to wear a mask and maintain a social distance of 6 feet, or I should say put the mask on outside if you can't maintain that 6-foot distance. What we've done, with our friends is, families will bring their own food or their own little setup on the picnic table, have disposable utensils, that kind of thing. All things that are very clearly, nicely defined in the CDC guidance that we've been trying to follow all summer.
Now let's talk travel heading into a holiday weekend. We've talked a lot about safety on a plane, but what about road trips? Should people avoid, rest stops, or should they be packing? How should they be packing to try to keep themselves safe?
Right. So I think there's 2 ways to think about travel, Savannah, is what to do before you travel and what to do or bring while traveling. Before you travel, you really need to find out what the amount of spread is in the destination that you're going, and also if there are any travel or quarantine restrictions where you're going and when you come back to, from where you are traveling from. And I think it's also super important to think about your own personal risk as well as people you live with. You don't want to bring something home to someone who might be at greater risk who lives in your household. While traveling, the usual, recommendations apply, and that is to have your mask and maintain your distance and wash your hands frequently and have your at least 60% alcohol with you. If you are going to a rest stop and you're using the gas pump, wipe it down with, with a disinfectant cloth. Definitely wash hands after you do that. And consider bringing your own food so that you're not necessarily going inside to get food at a rest stop, but, something like a drive-through or something like that would be safer than going inside. Again, each time you increase exposures to surfaces and to people, you're theoretically increasing your risk for, contracting the virus yourself.
Okay, Dr. Azar, thank you so much. Tips we can all use going into this long weekend. And again, good to see you.
You too.
Hey, NBC News viewers, thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on that button down here and click on any of the videos over here to watch the latest interviews, show highlights, and digital exclusives. Thanks for watching.